What he discovers beneath his ridiculed property is a vast Revolutionary War complex that hasn't been entered for over 2 centuries, and when he finally manages to break through its concealed entrance, what's inside leaves him awestruck and forever changes our understanding of American history. Jacob Mercer had always been the subject of whispers in Oak Ridge County, Virginia. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The 42-year-old former history teacher turned aspiring farmer had spent his life savings on 200 acres of what locals called the Deadlands, a rocky, uneven tract that hadn't produced a decent crop in living memory. The property, situated 15 miles from the nearest town of Coopersville, had been on the market for nearly a decade, with no interested buyers until Jacob arrived from Pennsylvania with dreams bigger than his farming experience. Might as well have bought swampland in Florida, Howard Daniels had remarked loudly at the Oak Ridge General Store when Jacob came in for supplies that first week. That Mercer fellow paid real money for dirt that won't grow weeds. The laughter that followed had burned in Jacob's ears, but he'd maintained his composure. The Deadlands had called to him from the moment he'd seen the listing online, not for their agricultural potential, but for their location. Situated just 8 miles from where General Washington's forces had reportedly camped during a lesser-known winter of the Revolutionary War, the property had featured in his doctoral research on supply lines during the American Revolution. Jacob's academic career had ended abruptly 3 years earlier when budget cuts eliminated his tenure-track position at Westfield College. The divorce that followed had left him with settlement money, an unfinished manuscript on Revolutionary War logistics, and a desire to start fresh somewhere meaningful. When the opportunity to purchase land near a historical site he'd studied for years presented itself, the decision had felt almost predestined. The locals' ridicule intensified during Jacob's first months in Oak Ridge County. His attempts to clear sections of the overgrown property revealed terrain that seemed actively hostile to farming, rocky outcroppings, unexpected sinkholes, and soil so acidic that the agricultural extension agent had raised his eyebrows and suggested Jacob consider literally any other career. What kept him going through those difficult early days was the property's one redeeming feature, a relatively flat 10-acre section on the eastern boundary that showed potential for cultivation. Local records indicated it had once supported crops. In the late 1800s, before being abandoned, Jacob had focused his limited resources on preparing this section, clearing decades of underbrush and fallen timber with second-hand equipment purchased at farm auctions. By early spring, the 10-acre section was finally ready for its first plowing in generations. Jacob had invested in a refurbished tractor with a heavy-duty plow attachment, a purchase that had further depleted his dwindling savings but represented his commitment to making this venture succeed. If he could demonstrate that even a portion of the Deadlands could be productive, perhaps he could secure financing to develop more of the property. The morning of April 17th dawned clear and cool, perfect conditions for the inaugural plowing. Jacob had risen before sunrise, performing a final inspection of the tractor's systems and adjusting the plow depth for the virgin soil. His hands trembled slightly as he climbed into the operator's seat, not from fear, but from the significance of the moment. This first furrow would either validate his vision or confirm the community's derision. The tractor's engine roared to life, its vibrations traveling up through the frame and into Jacob's body as he engaged the plow and began his careful advance across the field. He'd plotted his course the previous day, marking the optimal pattern with stakes and string to maximize efficiency in the irregular space. 50 feet into the first furrow, the tractor shuddered violently, and a sound like grinding metal echoed. across the peaceful morning landscape. The impact nearly threw Jacob from his seat as the tractor lurched forward, then stalled completely, the engine dying with a sputtering cough. "Damn it," Jacob muttered, his heart sinking. A major equipment failure on the very first day would not only delay his planting schedule, but would likely require repairs he couldn't afford. He climbed down from the cab, mentally calculating how much further this setback would stretch his nearly exhausted credit. Walking to the rear of the tractor, Jacob expected to find the plow damaged from striking one of the countless rocks that plagued the property. Instead, he found something far more perplexing. The plow had broken through what appeared to be a section of flat stone, revealing a dark opening beneath. Jacob's first thought was that he'd uncovered one of the sinkholes the agricultural agent had warned about, a potentially dangerous collapse in the limestone bedrock common to parts of Virginia. Kneeling cautiously at the edge of the opening, he shone his phone's flashlight into the darkness. What the light revealed wasn't the jagged natural formation of a sinkhole, but what appeared to be a perfectly squared-off edge of worked stone. The plow had broken through what looked like a flat stone slab that had been deliberately placed and concealed beneath several inches of soil. Jacob's heart rate quickened as his historian's mind immediately began generating possibilities. The area had been settled since the early 1700s, and underground root cellars or storage chambers weren't uncommon in colonial-era properties. But something about the precision of the stonework, visible in the narrow opening, suggested this was more substantial than a simple storage space. Returning to his pickup truck, Jacob retrieved a shovel and work gloves and began carefully widening the opening. As more of the concealing stone slab was exposed, he noticed something that sent a jolt of excitement through his body. Faint but unmistakable marks were carved into the stone's surface. Not random scratches, but deliberate symbols that appeared to be letters in a formal 18th century style. 2 hours of careful excavation revealed a portion of text. "Liberty's Keep, 1777. Surrounded by what appeared to be Masonic symbols, similar to those he'd studied in the architecture of early American government buildings. Jacob sat back on his heels, his mind racing. Liberty's Keep. The date placed it squarely during the Revolutionary War, during a period when Washington's forces had been operating in this region. Nothing in the historical record mentioned a structure with this name. Certainly nothing substantial enough to warrant underground construction of this apparent size and sophistication. For the first time since arriving in Oak Ridge County, the whispers and ridicule faded from Jacob's consciousness. The worthless land he'd purchased against all advice might contain something of genuine historical significance, perhaps even something that could rewrite our understanding of Revolutionary War infrastructure and operations. With trembling hands, Jacob reached for his phone. Before calling anyone, he hesitated, struck by the magnitude of what might lie beneath his ridiculed property. Whatever was down there had remained hidden for nearly 2.5 centuries. It deserved to be approached with proper caution and respect. Setting his phone aside, Jacob continued carefully removing soil from around the stone slab. The day's plowing was forgotten as historical mystery took precedence over agricultural ambition. Little did he know that his first and only furrow had set in motion events that would transform not just his own fortunes, but potentially our understanding of America's founding era. The Oak Ridge County Farmers Co-op meeting hall fell silent as Jacob Mercer pushed through the double doors. Conversations about crop prices and the unseasonably dry spring died mid-sentence as 24 pairs of eyes tracked his progress toward the coffee station. Jacob kept his gaze fixed straight ahead, his jaw set in what had become his permanent expression since moving to Virginia, determined neutrality. "Well, if it isn't Professor Plowman," came Howard Daniels' voice from a cluster of farmers near the bulletin board. Figured you'd have packed up and headed back north by now. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Scattered chuckles followed the remark. Jacob poured his coffee deliberately, added a single packet of sugar, and stirred it with the same methodical patience he applied to all tasks. 5 months in Oak Ridge County had taught him that responding to Howard's provocations only encouraged more of the same. "Just came to ask about that used seed drill Abernathy was selling," Jacob said to no one in particular, his voice steady. "Noticed the listing came down from the board last week." Earl Cooper, a 70-year-old soybean farmer whose family had worked the same 1,000 acres for generations, cleared his throat. "Tom sold it to his nephew from Harrisonburg. Didn't know you were interested. Would have saved you the trouble of asking if we'd known," Howard added with exaggerated innocence. "But then again, not sure what good a seed drill would do on the deadlands. Can't drill through stone, Professor." Jacob nodded, absorbing the information without acknowledging the jab. The used seed drill had been listed at 1/4 of the new price, a bargain he'd been saving for after completing the initial plowing. Another opportunity lost to the invisible network of local connections that continued to exclude him. "Appreciate the information," Jacob replied, sipping his coffee. "Anyone selling a decent cultivator, let me know. I'll be needing one next month." Howard exchanged glances with several other farmers, smirking. The unspoken message was clear. Jacob wouldn't last another month, much less make it to cultivation stage. "You're optimistic. I'll give you that," Earl said, his tone softer than Howard's outright mockery. "My grandfather used to talk about the Deadlands. Said they tried working that property back in the 30s during the Depression, brought in mules, dynamite, everything. Gave up after a season." Jacob had heard variations of this story from nearly everyone in the county. The Deadlands had become mythologized as unconquerable, a cautionary tale about the limits of human determination against nature's obstinance. "Times change. Equipment improves," Jacob answered simply, finishing his coffee. "Soil science has advanced since the Depression." "Soil science," Howard repeated, drawing out the phrase as though it were a foreign language. "Listen to the professor, boys. We've just been pushing dirt around all these years, but he's got science." Jacob deposited his empty cup in the trash and headed for the door, having gleaned what information he could from the hostile environment. Behind him, conversation resumed, likely at his expense, but he'd stopped caring about that weeks ago. Outside, the April sunshine momentarily lifted his spirits as he climbed into his pickup truck, a 15-year-old Ford with rust blooming along the wheel wells and 187,000 miles on the odometer. The truck, like everything else in Jacob's life, was a compromise between necessity and financial reality. The drive back to his property took 20 minutes along winding country roads. As he turned onto the gravel drive marked by a weathered mailbox bearing his name, Jacob allowed himself to survey his kingdom with a historian's perspective. What others saw as worthless, he saw as possibility rooted in past significance. The farmhouse itself was another testament to compromise, a 3-bedroom structure built in the 1940s that had stood vacant for years before Jacob's purchase. The real estate listing had generously described it as needing TLC, which had proven to be a euphemism for requiring complete renovation. Jacob had made the kitchen and 1-bedroom livable, but plastic sheeting still covered windows in unused rooms, and the porch sagged dangerously on its eastern corner. Parking beside the house, Jacob retrieved his mail, another foreclosure notice from Rockfield Bank regarding the property's previous owner, incorrectly addressed to him despite multiple calls to correct the error. He tossed it onto the growing pile of similar notices on his kitchen counter. The kitchen, like the rest of Jacob's living space, reflected a scholar's sensibilities more than a farmer's practicality. Books on Revolutionary War history, agricultural techniques, and Virginia's soil conditions were stacked on every available surface. His laptop sat open on the table, surrounded by handwritten notes about supply line logistics during Washington's Virginia campaigns. Jacob's unfinished manuscript, Feeding the Revolution, the Hidden Infrastructure of Washington's Army, lay beside the laptop, its margins filled with new observations since his arrival in Virginia. His academic interests hadn't diminished with his career change. If anything, proximity to historical sites had intensified his research passion. Settling at the table with a sandwich of home-cured ham, a welcome gift from Earl Cooper, whose gruff exterior occasionally yielded to unexpected generosity, Jacob reviewed his finances with the grim determination of a general assessing dwindling supplies. The numbers hadn't improved since yesterday. His savings had been depleted by property taxes, equipment purchases, and house repairs. The small pension from his teaching career covered basic living expenses, but couldn't sustain the significant investment required to make the farm operational. Without a successful planting and harvest this season, financial reality would force him to sell at a loss, validating every prediction the locals had made about his failure. Jacob closed the spreadsheet and opened his historical research instead, finding more comfort in the past than in his precarious present. His investigation into Washington's logistical operations during 1777 had uncovered references to a network of supply caches established throughout Virginia, secure locations where food, ammunition, and medical supplies could be stored away from British patrols. Most historians focused on the larger winter encampments like Valley Forge, but Jacob had built his academic reputation on illuminating the less documented aspects of revolutionary infrastructure. His theory that Washington's army had operated a more sophisticated logistics network than previously recognized had been gaining scholarly attention before budget cuts ended his academic career. The property map, spread beneath his research notes, showed the Deadlands in relation to known Revolutionary War routes. The coincidence of location had been his primary motivation for the purchase, the opportunity to conduct archaeological research on his own land without institutional constraints or permissions. But as financial reality continued to tighten around him like a vice, even this academic consolation had begun to feel hollow. Without resources for proper archaeological investigation, his theories would remain unproven speculation. As twilight settled over the farmhouse, Jacob powered down his laptop and prepared for another early morning. Tomorrow he'd attempt to repair the tractor and resume plowing, continuing his struggle against the resistant land and dwindling finances with the same stubborn persistence that had made him an object of both mockery and reluctant respect in Oak Ridge County. What Jacob couldn't know as he set his alarm for 5:10 a.m. was that tomorrow's plowing attempt would transform everything. His financial prospects, his academic theories, and his place in the community that had so readily dismissed him. Dawn broke over the Deadlands with a wash of pale gold light that transformed the rocky terrain into something almost beautiful. Jacob had been awake since 4:30, reviewing the tractor's manual by flashlight and mentally preparing for the day's work. The forecast promised clear skies, favorable conditions for what needed to be a productive day if he hoped to maintain his planting schedule. After a breakfast of instant coffee and toast, Jacob headed out to the equipment shed, a listing structure of corrugated metal that protected his modest collection of machinery from the elements. The John Deere 5320 tractor had been his largest investment, purchased at auction from a farm bankruptcy sale in the next county. At 15 years old, it wasn't new by any standard, but its 55-horsepower engine was sufficient for the scale of operation Jacob envisioned. "All right, old girl," Jacob murmured, running his hand along the tractor's faded green hood. "Let's try. This again?" He'd spent the previous evening adjusting the plow depth, setting it shallower than standard to accommodate the deadland's notoriously rocky composition. The soil analysis he'd commissioned had indicated decent fertility beneath. The top layer of stone and compacted clay. The challenge was reaching it without destroying his equipment. The tractor's engine turned over on the third attempt, coughing to life with a plume of diesel exhaust. Jacob let it idle, listening carefully for any concerning sounds before engaging. The hydraulic system to raise the plow attachment. Everything seemed functional, if not precisely optimal. Climbing into the operator's seat, Jacob oriented himself toward the eastern section of the property, the 10 acres he'd identified as having the greatest agricultural potential based on historical records and soil samples. The morning sun at his back cast long shadows ahead, highlighting the subtle contours of the land. Jacob engaged the plow and began a careful forward progress. The tractor vibrated beneath him as the blade bit into the soil, turning over the first few inches of earth in a dark ribbon behind him. He watched the furrow form with satisfaction, proper depth, clean edges. Despite the locals' predictions, the soil was yielding. He completed the first pass without incident, turning at the field's edge to begin the parallel return. The tractor's engine maintained a steady rhythm, and Jacob allowed himself a small smile. Perhaps the deadland's forbidding reputation was more superstition than agricultural reality. 20 minutes into the second pass, the plow struck something solid. The impact reverberated through the tractor's frame, metal striking stone with a distinctive clang that made Jacob wince. This was precisely the scenario he'd feared. Hidden stones large enough to damage equipment, but too deep to have been cleared during his preparation work. Disengaging the plow, Jacob shut down the engine and climbed down to assess the damage. The spring morning air carried the scent of freshly turned earth as he walked to the rear of the tractor, already calculating the cost of potential repairs against his dwindling budget. The plow blade had indeed struck stone, but not the irregular boulder he'd expected. Brushing away loose soil, Jacob revealed what appeared to be a flat, worked surface. His historian's training immediately registered the incongruity. Natural stone formations didn't create perfect right angles. Kneeling for a closer examination, Jacob cleared more dirt with his hands. The stone was slate-grey granite, smoothly dressed and fitted against adjacent pieces with remarkable precision. This wasn't a random formation or agricultural debris. It had the unmistakable characteristics of intentional construction. "What the hell?" Jacob muttered, clearing more soil. To reveal the extent of the stonework, the plow had broken through what appeared to be a corner section, creating a small opening perhaps 8 inches across. Cool air flowed from the dark space beneath, carrying a distinctive mustiness that spoke of long enclosed spaces. Jacob's heartbeat quickened as he retrieved a flashlight from the tractor's toolbox and directed its beam into the opening. The light revealed not solid earth as expected, but open space extending beyond the reach of his light, an underground chamber or passage of some kind. He sat back on his heels, mind racing. Underground structures weren't uncommon in colonial architecture. Root cellars, storage spaces, and occasionally more elaborate constructions had been documented throughout Virginia. But nothing in the county records had indicated any substantial historical structures on the Deadlands, certainly nothing of this apparent scale and sophistication. Working with renewed energy, Jacob retrieved a shovel from the tractor and began, carefully widening the opening, removing soil without disturbing the stone structure beneath. As more of the underground ceiling was exposed, a pattern emerged, deliberately laid stonework forming what appeared to be the top of a chamber or corridor. 2 hours of careful excavation revealed a section approximately 6 feet square. The stone ceiling had partially collapsed at one corner. Whether from natural deterioration or Jacob's plow remained unclear. creating an opening large enough for a person to potentially enter. As he cleared the last section of loose stone, Jacob noticed markings carved into one of the larger blocks. Brushing away centuries of accumulated soil, he revealed an inscription, Liberty's Keep, 1777. The date sent a jolt of excitement through him. 1777, during the American Revolution, when Washington's forces had been active in Virginia. The name Liberty's Keep evoked the revolutionary spirit of the era, suggesting this wasn't merely a storage cellar, but something more significant. Jacob's academic research had focused on the logistical infrastructure supporting Washington's army, the network of supply caches, communication routes and safe houses that enabled the Continental forces to operate effectively against the better-equipped British. Could this underground structure be part of that very network? The possibility was tantalizing enough that Jacob momentarily forgot his agricultural challenges. If this was indeed a Revolutionary War structure, it could provide physical evidence supporting his theories about Washington's sophisticated supply operations, theories that had been dismissed by some of his academic colleagues as speculative. Shining his flashlight through the opening again, Jacob could now make out what appeared to be a passage extending northward, its walls lined with the same precisely cut stonework. The floor, visible in sections where debris had settled unevenly, seemed to be laid brick rather than packed earth. The historian in Jacob wanted to descend immediately to explore this potential historical treasure. The practical farmer recognized the risks of entering an unstable underground structure without proper safety precautions. As much as the discovery thrilled him, he couldn't afford an accident when he lived alone on an isolated property with spotty cell service. Reluctantly, Jacob decided to secure the opening and make preparations for a proper exploration. He covered the exposed section with a tarp weighted down by stones, concealing it from casual observation. The day's ploughing was forgotten as he returned to the farmhouse, his mind filled with historical possibilities and practical considerations. Sitting at his kitchen table, Jacob began methodically listing what he would need: stronger lights, a ladder, proper protective gear, documentation equipment. The financial challenges that had dominated his thoughts that morning now seemed distant concerns, temporarily overshadowed by the historian's thrill of discovery. For the first time since arriving in Virginia, Jacob felt validation for his seemingly irrational decision to purchase the Deadlands. Perhaps it wasn't agricultural potential that made this property valuable, but historical significance that had remained hidden beneath the surface for nearly 2.5 centuries, waiting for someone with the right background to recognize its importance. Jacob's kitchen table disappeared beneath maps, historical documents, and research notes as night fell over the Deadlands. The discovery of the underground structure had energized him, temporarily pushing aside his financial worries in favor of historical investigation. His laptop glowed with digitized colonial-era maps of Virginia, which he compared against contemporary topographical surveys of Oak Ridge County. The timing, 1777, was particularly significant. It had been a pivotal year in the Revolutionary War, especially in Virginia, where British forces under General Cornwallis had been actively pursuing Washington's Continental Army. The inscription, Liberty's Keep, suggested a deliberate construction rather than an improvised shelter, something built with purpose and forethought. Jacob pulled out his dog-eared copy of Washington's Secret War by Thomas Fleming, flipping to the chapters on intelligence operations. Fleming had documented Washington's sophisticated spy network, but had made only passing references to physical infrastructure supporting these operations. Most historians focused on military movements and battles, not the logistical systems enabling those engagements. That had been the focus of Jacob's academic work, the overlooked support systems that made the Revolutionary War effort possible. His unfinished manuscript argued that Washington had established a more extensive network of supply caches and safe houses than commonly recognized. If Liberty's Keep was part of that network, it could provide physical evidence supporting his theories. "This could change everything," Jacob murmured, making notes on a legal pad. He retrieved a leather-bound journal from his bookshelf, the field diary of Captain William Hargrove of the Continental Army, which Jacob had acquired from a rare book dealer years earlier. Hargrove had served as a logistics officer under Washington during the Virginia campaigns of 1777-1778, and his diary contained tantalizing references to secure storage locations throughout the region. Jacob had previously assumed these referred to temporary caches rather than permanent structures. But one entry from September 1777 caught his attention with new significance. Completed inspection of LK underground placement ensures security from British patrols. Stone construction should endure despite the damp. Capacity sufficient for regiment supplies and secure documents. Location known only to W and trusted officers. The entry had always interested Jacob, but he'd never been able to definitively identify LK. Now, the connection seemed obvious. Liberty's Keep. Another entry from October mentioned provisions transferred to LK via night march. Position unmarked on any maps for security. Local sympathizers sworn to secrecy regarding existence. This aligned perfectly with the absence of the structure from any official historical records of the county. As Jacob continued his research, the history of the Deadlands themselves took on new significance. The property had changed hands numerous times since the Revolutionary era, but curiously had remained largely undeveloped, despite surrounding lands being converted to productive farms. County records showed the land had been originally granted to a Thomas Woodward in 1752, then transferred to his son-in-law James Caldwell in 1775, just before the Revolution began. Caldwell was documented as a Continental Army captain who later served in the Virginia legislature. Could he have offered his remote, rocky property for Washington's secret infrastructure? The timeline aligned perfectly with the 1777 date on the inscription. What was most striking was the property's subsequent history. After Caldwell's death in 1801, the land had passed through a succession of owners, none of whom had successfully developed it agriculturally. It was as though the property had been intentionally left fallow, its underground secrets protected, by its reputation for being unsuitable for farming. They knew, Jacob realized, the implication sending a chill down his spine. Generations of owners knew something was there and deliberately maintained the fiction of worthless land. This theory was supported by the property's sale history. The Deadlands had consistently sold for below-market prices and had often changed hands within the same network of families. Jacob had purchased it from the estate of Herbert Monroe, whose family had owned it since 1943. Before that, it had belonged to the Caldwell descendants until the Great Depression forced its sale. The historic preservation implications alone were staggering. If Liberty's Keep was indeed a Revolutionary War installation built to Washington's specifications, it would be among the most significant historical discoveries in Virginia in decades. Properly documented and preserved, it could rewrite understanding of Revolutionary War infrastructure and elevate Jacob's academic standing in the process. But with this realization came new concerns. Jacob's financial situation remained precarious. The bank had given him a 6-month grace period on his mortgage payments, a period that would end in less than 30 days. Without agricultural income or outside funding, he would face foreclosure, just as he had made this potentially groundbreaking discovery. Jacob opened his financial spreadsheet, the numbers no less grim than before. His remaining savings would cover basic living expenses for perhaps another 2 months. The farm equipment loans had already consumed his available credit. Without immediate income, he would lose the property, and with it, control over the historical site he'd discovered. There were options, each with significant drawbacks. He could approach the Virginia Historical Society or the National Park Service about the discovery, potentially securing preservation funding but losing autonomy over the research. University archaeology departments might offer resources in exchange for academic participation, but institutional involvement would bring bureaucracy and delays. Private investors might provide immediate funding, but would demand control or ownership stakes. There was also the possibility of applying for emergency historical preservation grants, though these typically required extensive documentation and took months to process. The most immediate concern was securing the site. If word of the discovery spread before Jacob established legal protections, treasure hunters or unauthorized excavations could damage the historical integrity of Liberty's Keep. Virginia law regarding archaeological finds on private property was complex, with overlapping state and federal regulations applying to Revolutionary War-era discoveries. Jacob's phone buzzed with a text message from Earl Cooper. "Noticed you didn't finish plowing today. Equipment trouble? Have some spare parts if needed." Car. Message reminded Jacob of his precarious position in the community. The locals who had ridiculed his purchase might view the historical discovery differently, either as validation of the property's value or as an opportunity for the county to claim a historical landmark. Either way, news would spread quickly. Once shared, he considered his response carefully before replying, "Minor issue with the plow, taking a day to make adjustments. Thanks for the offer." The partial truth bought him time to develop a strategy. Jacob needed to document the discovery properly before announcing it, establishing his academic claim while determining the best approach for preservation and continued research. As midnight approached, Jacob organized his research materials into a coherent timeline, photographing key documents and creating digital backups. Whatever path he chose, proper documentation would be essential both for historical accuracy and for protecting his interests. The stakes had shifted dramatically in the space of a single day. What had begun as a struggle for agricultural viability had transformed into a race to preserve and document a potential national treasure. Jacob's academic background had suddenly become his greatest asset, rather than the impractical liability Howard Daniels and others had mocked. Setting his alarm for dawn, Jacob finally sought a few hours' rest, his mind still racing with historical connections and practical concerns. Tomorrow would require careful planning and execution, the first steps in bringing Liberty's Keep back into the light after nearly 2.5 centuries of darkness. Dawn had barely broken when Jacob returned to the tarp-covered opening, carrying a backpack loaded with equipment. He'd slept fitfully, his dreams filled with underground passages and revolutionary soldiers moving quietly through the Virginia countryside. The morning air was cool and damp, mist clinging to the low areas of the deadlands as though the earth itself were breathing. Jacob had assembled his exploration kit carefully: a hard hat with mounted LED lamp, a professional-grade flashlight with spare batteries, a digital camera, measuring tape, notebook, gloves, dust mask, and a small toolkit. He'd also brought a coil of rope and a lightweight aluminum ladder borrowed from the farmhouse. Basic safety precautions for exploring an unstable underground structure. Before removing the tarp, Jacob set up a tripod and mounted his camera to document the exterior of the discovery. The historian's discipline of methodical documentation warred with his excitement to explore what lay beneath. He photographed the exposed stonework from multiple angles, paying particular attention to the inscription and the construction techniques. visible in the damaged section. "Liberty's Keep 1777, Jacob murmured, tracing the carved letters with his fingertip. The stonework showed remarkable craftsmanship, precisely cut blocks fitted together with minimal mortar, a technique requiring skilled masons. This hadn't been hastily constructed during wartime exigency, but carefully planned and executed. With the exterior documentation complete, Jacob secured the ladder against the opening, testing its stability before beginning his descent. He'd expanded the entrance slightly since yesterday, clearing additional loose stone to create an opening approximately 3 feet square, tight, but passable for his frame. "Here goes nothing," he muttered, switching on his headlamp and beginning the careful climb down. The ladder extended 8 feet to the floor below, placing him in what appeared to be a passage or corridor roughly 6 feet high and 5 feet wide. The air was noticeably cooler underground, with a distinctive mustiness that spoke of centuries without circulation. Jacob's headlamp cut through the darkness, revealing brick flooring and stone walls extending in both directions. Standing motionless, Jacob absorbed his surroundings with the trained eye of a historian. The construction was impressive. Arched ceiling, dressed stone walls, and brick flooring laid in a herringbone pattern. This was no hastily constructed bunker, but a deliberately engineered structure built to last. Remarkable preservation, Jacob noted aloud, his voice sounding strangely flat in the enclosed space. He began taking photographs, documenting the construction details while maintaining his position near the entrance. The passage extended approximately 30 feet to the north, before appearing to open into a larger space. To the south, it continued perhaps 20 feet before turning at a right angle eastward. Jacob made careful notes of the dimensions and orientation, sketching the layout in his notebook. After completing the initial documentation, Jacob decided to explore the northern direction first, moving carefully along the passage while constantly checking the ceiling for signs of structural weakness. The brick floor was surprisingly intact, with only occasional damaged sections where moisture had penetrated. At intervals along the walls, Jacob noticed small niches that might have once held lamps or candles. Some contained fragments of what appeared to be rusted metal, perhaps the remains of sconces or brackets. He photographed each, noting their regular spacing approximately every 10 feet. The passage opened into a roughly circular chamber, approximately 20 feet in diameter. Unlike the corridor, this space had a domed ceiling rising to perhaps 12 feet at its center. Around the perimeter stood a series of stone shelves or benches built directly into the walls. The chamber had clearly been designed for some specific purpose. Perhaps meetings or storage? What caught Jacob's attention immediately were the symbols carved into the central floor. A compass rose surrounded by Masonic imagery. At the center of the design was an inlaid metal plate, approximately 18 inches in diameter, green with verdigris, but still discernible as brass or copper. "Masonic connections," Jacob whispered, excitement building. Washington's Masonic affiliation was well documented, as was the Fraternal Order's support for the revolutionary cause. Many of Washington's officers had been Freemasons, forming a trusted network within the Continental Army's command structure. Kneeling beside the metal plate, Jacob carefully photographed the design before examining it more closely. The plate appeared to be a cover of some kind, with a recessed handle that had long since fused with oxidation. Around its circumference were engraved words, partially obscured by verdigris but still legible. "In virtue and silence we preserve liberty's future." The chamber contained no obvious artifacts beyond its architectural features, no furniture, weapons, or documents immediately visible. Jacob speculated that the space had been cleared when the installation was decommissioned, or perhaps looted in the intervening centuries despite its hidden entrance. After thoroughly documenting the circular chamber, Jacob returned to the main passage and proceeded to explore the southern section. The passage turned eastward, as he'd observed earlier, continuing for approximately 40 feet before terminating at a solid wooden door reinforced with iron bands. The door's preservation was remarkable. The dry underground conditions had prevented the expected deterioration of organic materials. It stood firmly closed, secured by what appeared to be an elaborate lock mechanism. Unlike modern locks with keyholes, this featured a circular brass plate with multiple concentric rings that could apparently be rotated to specific positions. A combination lock, Jacob realized, 18th century style. Such mechanisms were rare but not unknown in colonial America, typically reserved for high-security applications like bank vaults or government facilities. Its presence here further confirmed the importance of whatever Liberty's Keep had been designed to protect. The lock mechanism showed signs of deliberate design. The outer ring contained 13 stars, while inner rings featured various patriotic symbols including eagles, Liberty bells, and what appeared to be state designations. Without the correct combination, forcing the door would likely damage both the mechanism and potentially the historical integrity of whatever lay beyond. Jacob photographed the door and lock in detail, making careful notes about its construction and the symbols visible on each ring. Breaking the lock's combination would require additional research. Perhaps clues existed in Revolutionary-era documents, or in the Masonic symbolism throughout the installation. Checking his watch, Jacob was startled to discover he'd been underground for nearly 3 hours. Time had slipped away as he documented the remarkable discovery. His initial exploration had confirmed that Liberty's Keep was far more extensive and sophisticated than a simple storage cache. This was a deliberately constructed facility with multiple chambers and security features. The historical significance was immense. Nothing of this scale from the Revolutionary War period had been discovered intact in decades. Most underground structures from the era had been documented and preserved long ago, or had deteriorated beyond recognition. Liberty's Keep represented an unparalleled opportunity to study revolutionary infrastructure firsthand. Reluctantly, Jacob decided to conclude his initial exploration. He'd gathered enough documentation to begin serious research into the facility's purpose and to support grant applications or historical society interest. More importantly, he needed to secure the site properly before proceeding further. Climbing back up the ladder to daylight, Jacob was momentarily disoriented by the bright Virginia sunshine after hours in the dimly lit underground passages. As his eyes adjusted, he noticed a vehicle approaching on the property's access road, a white pickup truck with county government markings. Jacob quickly covered the opening with the tarp, securing it with stones before the vehicle reached him. The unexpected visitor meant his window for private research was already closing. The discovery was about to become known beyond the boundaries of the Deadlands, for better or worse. The white pickup came to a stop 30 yards from where Jacob stood, dust settling around its tires as County Assessor Dennis Whitfield emerged from the driver's seat. A thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a clipboard, Whitfield represented the bureaucratic machinery of Oak Ridge County, machinery that had generally operated against Jacob's interests since his arrival. "Mr. Mercer," Whitfield called, picking his way across the uneven ground. "Didn't expect to find you out in this section today. Thought you'd be working that eastern acreage you cleared." Jacob forced a casual smile, positioning himself to block the assessor's view of the tarp-covered opening. "Just checking soil conditions across different sections. Never hurts to have options." Whitfield nodded absently, consulting his clipboard. "Well, I'm here for the quarterly property assessment. Tax department likes to keep records updated on all agricultural attempts in the county, successes and otherwise." The implied criticism wasn't subtle, but Jacob had grown accustomed to the county's skepticism regarding his farming ambitions. In this instance, the focus on agricultural failure worked to his advantage, distracting from what lay beneath the tarp behind him. "Happy to show you around," Jacob offered, gesturing toward the farmhouse. "Maybe we could start at the outbuildings and work our way back to the fields." Whitfield's gaze lingered on the tractor parked nearby, its plow attachment still engaged. "Couldn't help noticing you didn't make much progress yesterday. Equipment problems." "Minor adjustments," Jacob answered quickly. "These old machines require constant tuning for rocky soil." "Indeed," Whitfield replied, making a notation on his clipboard. "Speaking of rocky soil, I should mention there's been some interest in your property recently." Jacob kept his expression neutral despite the alarm bells ringing internally. "Interest from whom?" "Mason Development Group has been inquiring about several properties in the county," Whitfield explained, studying Jacob's reaction. "They're particularly interested in historical properties with unique characteristics." The deliberate emphasis on unique suggested Whitfield knew or suspected something. Jacob maintained his composure, though his mind raced with possibilities. Mason Development Group wasn't familiar to him, but developers had been increasingly active throughout the region, converting agricultural land to residential subdivisions. The Deadlands hardly seem like prime development real estate, Jacob observed carefully. Whitfield adjusted his glasses. "Apparently they're diversifying into historical tourism, Civil War battlefields, colonial homesteads, that sort of thing. Their representative specifically mentioned your property during yesterday's Planning Commission meeting." "Yesterday?" Jacob repeated, the timing too coincidental to ignore. Someone had learned of his discovery, perhaps from satellite imaging or local observation. The tractor parked in the same location for hours would have been visible from the county road. "They've made preliminary inquiries about zoning variances for historical tourism development," Whitfield continued. "Just exploratory at this stage, but they seem quite interested in fast-tracking the process." Jacob nodded slowly, processing the implications. "I appreciate the information, Mr. Whitfield. I hadn't considered the tourism potential of the property." "Few have," Whitfield replied dryly, "which makes their specific interest noteworthy." As they walked toward the farmhouse, Jacob spotted another vehicle approaching, Howard Daniels's distinctive blue truck with its oversized tires and chrome accents. The arrival of his most vocal critic immediately after the county assessor's visit stretched coincidence beyond credibility. "Appears you're popular today," Whitfield observed as Howard parked beside his county vehicle. Howard approached with his characteristic swagger, nodding briefly to Whitfield before addressing Jacob. "Heard you might be having equipment troubles. Thought I'd offer a neighborly hand." The transparent pretense confirmed Jacob's suspicion that word was spreading. Howard had never previously shown the slightest inclination toward neighborly assistance. "Appreciate the thought," Jacob replied carefully. "Just making some minor adjustments." Howard's gaze drifted toward the distant tractor and the tarp-covered area beyond. "Earl mentioned you quit early yesterday. Not like you to leave daylight unused." "Sometimes research takes precedence over fieldwork," Jacob answered deliberately. "Vague research," Howard repeated, exchanging glances with Whitfield. "I heard there's been some interest in historical aspects of the Deadlands, Revolutionary War connections and such." The confirmation that specific historical information was circulating sent a jolt of concern through Jacob. Information about the Revolutionary War connection could only have come from someone who knew about Liberty's Keep, either through observation or from someone Jacob had contacted during his research. "Every property in Virginia has history," Jacob replied neutrally, "some more documented than others." The county assessor completed his inspection with unusual thoroughness, paying particular attention to property boundaries and topographical features. Howard lingered throughout, offering unsolicited commentary on soil conditions and making pointed inquiries about Jacob's future agricultural plans. As both vehicles finally departed, Jacob watched them from the farmhouse porch, the knot in his stomach tightening. The casual visits had been reconnaissance, their timing and focus too deliberate to be coincidental. Whatever window of privacy he might have had for investigating Liberty's Keep was rapidly closing. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unfamiliar number. Mr. Mercer, Mason Development Group would appreciate an opportunity to discuss the historical potential of your property. Available to meet tomorrow. Time-sensitive matter. The external pressure had begun, and Jacob suspected it would only intensify. His discovery had somehow leaked, triggering interested parties to converge on the Deadlands with alarming speed. Whatever Liberty's Keep contained, others were now racing to claim it. The University Library at Charlottesville stood as a bastion of academic rigor amid the increasingly chaotic situation surrounding Liberty's Keep. Jacob had made the 90-minute drive at dawn, leaving his property only after installing motion-activated game cameras around the tarp-covered entrance. The cameras, purchased last fall for monitoring potential crop damage from deer, now served as his only security system against trespassers. Professor Eleanor Winters received him in her cluttered office overlooking the university quad. At 72, she remained the preeminent scholar on Revolutionary War logistics in Virginia, having authored definitive works on Washington's supply networks. More importantly to Jacob, she had been his doctoral advisor before budget cuts ended his academic career. "Jacob Mercer," she said warmly, rising from behind stacks of papers. 3 years of silence and suddenly you need an emergency consultation. I assume this isn't about crop rotation strategies. Jacob placed his laptop on her desk, opening a folder of photographs. I found something, Dr. Winters. Something that changes everything we've theorized about Washington's infrastructure. Eleanor's skepticism dissolved as she examined the images, her expression transforming from polite interest to focused intensity. She enlarged photographs of the Masonic symbols, the inscribed date, and particularly the combination lock mechanism. "Liberty's Keep," she murmured. "It's not just theoretical." "You've heard of it?" Jacob asked, surprised. "References exist in Washington's correspondence with Hamilton," Eleanor explained, turning to her bookshelf. "Cryptic mentions of LK that most scholars dismissed as a code name for a contact rather than a location." She retrieved a leather-bound volume, flipping to a marked page. "Here, November 1777, Washington writes, 'Ensure the contents of LK remain secure from enemy intelligence.' The material therein would prove catastrophic in British hands." Jacob leaned forward. "What material? What was stored there?" "That's always been the question," Eleanor replied, studying the photos again. "The prevailing theory was military intelligence, maps, troop movements, agent identities, but this construction," she gestured to the images of the stone corridor and domed chamber. "This is far too elaborate for simple document storage." "The combination lock suggests something extremely valuable," Jacob noted. "Or dangerous," Eleanor added. Washington was notably cautious about certain types of information, especially communications that might compromise the French alliance. If intercepted, she moved to another bookshelf, retrieving a slim volume bound in faded red leather. "This might help with the lock mechanism. It's a compendium of 18th century security devices compiled by Benjamin Tallmadge, Washington's intelligence." "Chief," Jacob accepted the book carefully. "I'm not the only one looking for answers, Dr. Winters. There's a development group suddenly interested in my property, specifically for its historical significance. The county is asking questions. Even my neighbors are suddenly attentive." Eleanor's expression grew concerned. "The Culper ring." "I'm sorry. Not the original, of course," she clarified. "The modern version, a historical acquisition group that identifies and purchases Revolutionary War sites before public discovery. They have representatives in most Virginia counties, monitoring property transactions and local gossip for potential Sites. You're saying there's an organized group specifically looking for places like Liberty's Keep? Eleanor nodded grimly. Founded by private collectors and certain political families with revolutionary connections. They operate through various corporate fronts, development companies, historical tourism ventures, agricultural investment groups. Mason Development Group? Likely one of their fronts, Eleanor confirmed. They moved aggressively when the Mitchell powder house was discovered in Fairfax County last year. By the time state preservationists arrived, the site had been professionally excavated and all artifacts removed to private research facilities. The implications were disturbing. Jacob wasn't facing merely curious neighbors or opportunistic developers, but an organized operation with experience acquiring revolutionary sites before they could be properly documented or protected. "I need to decode that lock mechanism," Jacob said, his urgency increasing. "Whatever's behind that door needs proper historical documentation before these people get involved." Eleanor hesitated before opening her desk drawer. "There's someone else you should talk to. Catherine Woodward, at the State Historical Society. Her family has connections to revolutionary history in Oak Ridge County." "Woodward," Jacob repeated. "There was a Thomas Woodward who originally owned the Deadlands property before the Revolution." "Precisely," Eleanor replied, writing down contact information. "Catherine may have family records that could help with the lock combination. But Jacob—" She looked up with serious concern. "Be careful whom you trust. Revolutionary artifacts command enormous prices in private markets, especially those with Washington connections." As Jacob prepared to leave, Eleanor placed a hand on his arm. "One more thing. Check the floor in the domed chamber, directly beneath the Masonic compass rose." "The metal plate?" "I noticed it but couldn't open it. These installations often had emergency exits," she explained. "If the main entrance was discovered, defenders needed an alternate escape route. Washington was meticulous about such details." Jacob's drive back to Oak Ridge County was filled with new determination and increasing anxiety. The stakes had risen significantly, not just preservation of a historical site, but protection against what appeared to be an organized operation accustomed to acquiring such discoveries through various means, legal or otherwise. He made one stop before returning to the Deadlands. The office of the Oak Ridge Historical Society, housed in a converted Victorian home on the town's main street. Catherine Woodward wasn't officially scheduled to be there, but Eleanor's call ahead had arranged an urgent meeting. The slender woman who greeted him had the poised demeanor of old Virginia society, but her firm handshake and direct gaze suggested practical competence beyond social graces. "Professor Winters explained your situation," Catherine said, leading him to a private research room. "The Woodward family has maintained certain records regarding Liberty's Keep for generations. We've been waiting for someone to find it who values history over profit." She unlocked an ancient filing cabinet, retrieving a sealed envelope. "This contains information about the lock mechanism passed down through the Woodward family since 1781. I believe you're the first person outside the family to see it in nearly 250 years." Jacob accepted the envelope with a historian's reverence for primary sources. "Why trust me with this?" Catherine smiled slightly. "Because you bought the Deadlands to research rather than develop. Because you contacted legitimate historians rather than antiquities dealers. And because, Mr. Mercer, this discovery belongs to history, not to private collections." Back at the Deadlands, Jacob found his property transformed by the day's absence. A white SUV with darkly tinted windows was parked at the end of his driveway. Its occupants nowhere in sight. Fresh tire tracks crisscrossed sections of the property where vehicles had no legitimate reason to travel. Most concerning, the motion-activated cameras he'd placed around Liberty's Keep had been disabled, their memory cards removed, the devices themselves positioned neatly on the top, as though to send a message. Jacob remained in his truck, surveying the situation while mentally reviewing his options. Confrontation seemed unwise. Whoever had trespassed so boldly likely had resources beyond his own. Calling the sheriff might provide temporary protection, but would inevitably lead to questions about what exactly he was protecting. Questions that would make Liberty's keep public knowledge before he could properly document it. The envelope from Catherine Woodward lay on the passenger seat, containing what might be the key to unlocking the Revolutionary-era door. Its contents represented both opportunity and danger, the chance to document a historical treasure and the risk of exposing something coveted by powerful interests. His phone buzzed with another text message from Mason Development Group. Final. Opportunity to discuss mutually beneficial arrangement regarding your property's historical features. Meeting tomorrow, 9 a.m. at your location. After that, alternative approaches will be necessary. The thinly veiled threat crystallized Jacob's decision. Whatever window remained for independent investigation was closing rapidly. By tomorrow, Mason's representatives would likely arrive with legal documents, persuasive offers, or more concerning methods of acquiring access to Liberty's keep. Night had fallen by the time Jacob parked behind his barn, concealing his vehicle from the road. He gathered his exploration equipment along with additional supplies, a better camera with night photography capabilities, extra batteries, water, energy, bars, and the aluminum ladder. Most importantly, he brought Catherine Woodward's sealed envelope and the reference book on 18th century security mechanisms borrowed from Professor Winters. Moving across his property using only moonlight for guidance, Jacob avoided the most direct path to Liberty's keep. The disabled cameras suggested surveillance might be ongoing, making stealth essential. He circled widely through a wooded section, approaching the site from the opposite direction of his usual route. The tarp remained in place, though Jacob noted fresh footprints in the surrounding soil. Multiple individuals had examined the entrance recently. Using his phone's night mode camera, he documented the disturbances before carefully removing the covering. The exposed opening appeared unchanged, though Jacob noticed fresh scrape marks where someone had tested the stability of the surrounding stonework. He secured his ladder and descended into the passage, his headlamp illuminating the underground corridor exactly as he'd left it, or almost exactly. Subtle differences registered immediately to his historian's trained perception. Dust patterns on the brick floor showed recent footprints. Someone had entered Liberty's keep during his absence, despite the challenging access. More concerning, they had attempted to conceal their presence by sweeping the floor, but had missed areas near the walls. Jacob moved directly to the locked wooden door, examining it for signs of tampering. The 18th century combination mechanism appeared undisturbed, suggesting whoever had entered hadn't managed to decode it. This offered a small advantage. Whatever lay beyond the door likely remained intact. Settling on the floor of the passage, Jacob finally opened Catherine Woodward's envelope. Inside was a single sheet of parchment, yellowed with age but carefully preserved. The handwriting was formal, precise, the penmanship of a different era. The sea, stars align as 13 colonies unite in common cause. Liberty begins with independence declared, continues through endurance tested, and culminates in victory achieved. The eagle watches from the center of all things. Below this cryptic message was a signature: Captain Thomas Woodward, 3rd Virginia Regiment, Keeper of the Key, 1781. Jacob compared the message against photographs of the lock mechanism, understanding dawning as he identified the connections. The outer ring contained 13 stars, representing the colonies. The middle rings featured symbols including the Liberty Bell, Valley Forge, and Yorktown, representing declaration, endurance, and victory. At the very center was a small eagle. Design: Using Professor Winter's reference book, Jacob found illustrations of similar mechanisms from the period. The combination likely required aligning specific symbols with marker points on the outer casing, a sophisticated security system. For the 18th century, after 30 minutes of careful analysis, Jacob believed he understood the sequence. The lock required aligning July 4, 1776, Independence declared, with the first marker, then December 19, 1777, Valley Forge, endurance tested, with the second, and finally, October 19, 1781, Yorktown surrender victory achieved, with the third. His hands trembled slightly as he rotated the rings to the first position. No response. He continued to the second alignment, still nothing. As he completed the third position, aligning the Yorktown symbol with the final marker, a distinct click echoed in the underground passage. Jacob held his breath, placing his hand on the ancient door handle and applying gentle pressure. After a moment of resistance, the mechanism yielded, and the door swung inward on surprisingly well-preserved hinges. The beam of his headlamp penetrated a darkness undisturbed for centuries, illuminating what lay beyond the threshold. What he saw made his historian's heart race with excitement and scholarly awe. The room beyond was approximately 20 feet square, its walls lined with wooden shelving and cabinets. Unlike the passage and domed chamber, this room appeared untouched. By time, a perfectly preserved capsule from the Revolutionary era. As Jacob stepped across the threshold, he realized he had crossed his own point of no return. Whatever consequences might follow from Mason Development Group, from local authorities, from the academic community, there was no turning back. Liberty's Keep had protected its secrets for nearly 2.5 centuries. Now those secrets would finally be revealed. The door swung shut behind him with a decisive thud, the lock mechanism automatically re-engaging. Jacob was now sealed inside Liberty's Keep with whatever historical treasures or dangers the Revolutionary-era facility had been designed to protect. The preservation inside the sealed chamber was extraordinary. Jacob's headlamp revealed rows of wooden cabinets with brass fittings, their surfaces free from the rot and deterioration one would expect after centuries underground. The air was dry and surprisingly fresh, suggesting some form of passive ventilation system had kept the environment stable. "Remarkable," Jacob whispered, his voice echoing slightly in the enclosed space. Unlike the outer corridor and domed chamber, this room contained intact artifacts, dozens of them. Wooden document boxes labeled with carefully inked identifications lined the shelves. Rolled maps secured with ribbon occupied a specialized cabinet with horizontal drawers. A central table held what appeared to be surveying equipment and mathematical instruments, positioned as though their users had simply stepped away momentarily rather than centuries ago. Jacob methodically photographed the room before approaching any objects, documenting the arrangement and condition of everything visible. His academic training took precedence over excitement. Proper documentation came first, handling artifacts second. The document boxes drew his attention first. Each bore labels in meticulous 18th century handwriting. Correspondence, French. Allies, intelligence reports, New York. Agent communications, Philadelphia. This wasn't merely a supply cache, it was an intelligence archive of extraordinary significance. With gloved hands, Jacob carefully opened the first box labeled Continental Congress, Secret Resolutions. Inside were dozens of documents, the paper still supple and the ink remarkably preserved. The top document bore the signature of John Hancock and contained discussions of diplomatic approaches to European powers beyond France, potential alliances that had never appeared in conventional historical records. "This changes the entire historical narrative," Jacob murmured, photographing each page before carefully returning it to its original position. The next box contained military communications, including battle plans with Washington's personal annotations. These weren't copies or drafts, but original documents bearing the signatures of key revolutionary figures: Hamilton, Lafayette, von Steuben, Knox. Their preservation created an unfiltered window into Revolutionary War decision-making beyond anything previously available to historians. But the true revelation came when Jacob examined the contents of a leather portfolio marked simply Agent Identities, Classification, Most Secret. Inside were detailed records of Washington's spy network, names, locations, methods, and coded communication systems. Many of the listed operatives had never appeared in known historical records, revealing an intelligence apparatus far more extensive than scholars had previously documented. The complete Culper Ring records, Jacob realized, recognizing references to known spies like Tolmadge and Woodhull, alongside dozens of previously unidentified agents. These documents would fundamentally alter understanding of Revolutionary-era intelligence operations, and potentially require revising countless historical accounts. Moving to the map drawers, Jacob discovered detailed surveys of British fortifications, complete with annotations regarding weaknesses and potential access points. Unlike the rough sketches preserved in other archives, these were precisely measured drawings with mathematical calculations for artillery trajectories and troop movements. As Jacob continued his exploration, the true purpose of Liberty's Keep became clear. This wasn't merely a supply depot or temporary hiding place, but a purpose-built intelligence archive, a secure repository for Washington's most sensitive documents and information. The facility had been designed to preserve critical intelligence that couldn't risk capture in a mobile headquarters, yet needed to remain accessible to authorized personnel. In historical context, the significance was staggering. During the Revolutionary War, Washington had faced constant pressure to share intelligence with Congress, where operational security was notoriously weak. Liberty's Keep represented his solution, a secure facility known only to his most trusted officers, where truly sensitive information could be preserved while still technically complying with congressional oversight. The implications extended beyond historical interest. These documents would fundamentally reshape understanding of the Revolutionary period, revealing previously unknown international connections, identifying unrecognized contributors to American independence, and potentially affecting the legacies of prominent historical figures. One document particularly captured Jacob's attention: a letter from Washington to Thomas Woodward, dated December 1781, after the Yorktown victory. Upon successful conclusion of our present struggle, the contents of Liberty's Keep must remain secured until such time as their revelation serves the Republic without endangering those who served our cause. You and your descendants are charged with this solemn duty. When the proper guardian discovers this repository, they will recognize the appropriate moment for history's complete telling. The letter suggested Washington had intentionally created a time capsule, preserving sensitive information until it could be revealed without damaging the fragile new nation or exposing those who had risked everything for independence. Jacob realized with growing certainty that he was that proper guardian mentioned in Washington's letter, the historian who would determine when and how these documents entered the public record. The responsibility was enormous, particularly given the aggressive interest already demonstrated by Mason Development Group and others. As he continued documenting the chamber's contents, Jacob discovered something unexpected beneath the central table. A metal plate similar to the one in the domed chamber, but smaller and engraved with different symbolism. Professor Winters's suggestion about emergency exits returned to him. If the main entrance was compromised, this might provide an alternate escape route. Examining the plate revealed a simple locking mechanism requiring only a quarter turn. When Jacob rotated it, the plate lifted easily, revealing a narrow passage with brick steps descending into darkness. The air flowing from below felt fresher than the chamber atmosphere, suggesting the passage might lead to the surface somewhere on his property. With the core documentation complete, Jacob faced a critical decision. He couldn't possibly transport all these documents himself, nor could he risk leaving them vulnerable to the alternative approaches Mason development had threatened. The tunnel might provide both an escape route and a means of securing select documents until proper preservation could be arranged. Selecting the most immediately significant materials, Washington's letter to Woodward, the agent identities portfolio, and several key military communications, Jacob carefully packed them in his backpack. The rest would remain in their astonishingly well-preserved environment until he could arrange proper academic and governmental protection. As Jacob prepared to explore the escape tunnel, the implications of his discovery continued to unfold in his mind. The Deadlands hadn't been worthless at all. They had been deliberately preserved as unremarkable to protect what lay beneath. Generations of owners had maintained this fiction, likely including some who never knew exactly what they were protecting, but honored the charge passed down through families like the Woodwards. The escape tunnel extended approximately 60 yards before terminating at a vertical shaft with iron rungs embedded in the stone wall. Jacob climbed carefully, his backpack heavy with historical documents, until he reached a wooden trapdoor secured from below by a simple iron bar. Sliding the bar aside, he pushed upward, moving through fallen leaves and dirt as the trapdoor opened to reveal night sky above. Jacob emerged into a small clearing surrounded by hickory trees, a location he recognized as being near the property's southeastern boundary, well away from both the farmhouse and the main entrance to Liberty's Keep. The concealed exit had been cleverly positioned to allow discreet departure from the underground facility. Securing the trapdoor and covering it with natural debris, Jacob oriented himself using the stars, a navigation method fitting for a night spent discovering revolutionary secrets. He began moving cautiously through the woods toward the farmhouse, planning to secure the documents before determining his next steps. The distant sound of vehicles brought him to an abrupt halt. Through the trees, Jacob could see headlights moving along his driveway, multiple vehicles approaching the farmhouse well past midnight. This wasn't a casual visit or even an intimidation tactic. It was a coordinated operation under cover of darkness. Keeping to the tree line, Jacob circled toward the equipment barn, maintaining visual contact with the intruders. 3 black SUVs with Virginia plates had parked near the farmhouse. Men in dark clothing moved with practiced efficiency, carrying equipment toward the area where Liberty's Keep's main entrance was located. Jacob counted 6 individuals there, movements suggesting professional training rather than amateur enthusiasm. From his concealed position, Jacob photographed the vehicles and intruders using his phone's night mode. Their license plates, faces, and equipment would provide evidence of trespassing at minimum, possibly more serious offenses depending on their actions. As the group reached the main entrance to Liberty's Keep, their leader, a tall man giving quiet directions to the others, removed what appeared to be official documentation from a leather portfolio. Even from a distance, Jacob could make out government letterhead and official seals. Department of Historical Resources Emergency Preservation Order, the man announced to his team, though no representatives of that department would conduct operations. At midnight, without contacting the property owner, secure the site perimeter and prepare for artifact recovery. The falsified documentation confirmed Jacob's suspicions. This was Mason Development Group's alternative approach, disguised as official government action to provide cover for what amounted to organized looting of a historical site. Jacob needed to act quickly. The documents in his backpack represented irreplaceable historical treasures, but those still within Liberty's keep were equally significant. Once Mason's team breached the interior chamber, centuries of carefully preserved history would disappear into private collections, never to benefit public knowledge or academic research. His phone showed no signal, either from the remote location or, more concerningly, from deliberate signal jamming by the intruders. Driving to town for help would not take too long. By the time he returned with authorities, the site would be emptied of its most valuable contents. One option remained. Catherine Woodward had mentioned that the Oak Ridge Historical Society maintained an emergency protocol for precisely this situation. Revolutionary-era sites in Virginia had faced similar threats of private acquisition throughout the years, leading legitimate historical organizations to develop rapid response measures. The decision crystallized in Jacob's mind. He would circle around to his truck, hidden behind the barn, and make for the Historical Society building in town. If Mason's team followed standard practice, they would secure and document the site tonight, but likely wait until daylight for major excavation work. That provided a narrow window to mobilize legitimate preservation authorities. As Jacob began moving toward the barn, the night's silence was broken by a sharp crack, the sound of the ancient wooden door within Liberty's keep being forced open. The race for revolutionary secrets had entered its final, decisive phase. Catherine Woodward's expression remained impressively composed as Jacob explained the situation, despite being roused from bed at nearly 1 in the morning. The Oak Ridge Historical Society building's lights blazed against the darkness as she unlocked a secure room in the basement, revealing communications equipment and emergency protocols posted on the walls. The preservation network has prepared for this scenario for generations, she explained, activating what appeared to be a dedicated satellite communication system. Mason Development Group has been raiding historical sites across Virginia for decades, operating under various names and using increasingly sophisticated methods. Jacob opened his backpack, carefully displaying the documents he'd recovered. Washington's personal correspondence, operational plans, and complete intelligence records. There's much more still in the chamber. Catherine photographed each document with a specialized scanner that simultaneously uploaded encrypted images to secure servers. Digital preservation first, physical preservation second, she explained. Even if they take everything, the historical record will survive. She lifted a vintage rotary telephone that seemed oddly out of place among the modern equipment. This connects to a private network established during the Cold War, completely separate from public telecommunications. Mason's signal jammers won't affect it. Within minutes, Catherine had activated what she called the Liberty Protocol, an emergency response system involving state historical preservation officers, federal agencies, and academic institutions with Revolutionary War expertise. The protocol had been established specifically to counter private acquisition of significant historical sites. Teams are mobilizing from Richmond and Washington, she confirmed, but they'll take hours to arrive. We need a more immediate response. Jacob studied the Historical Society's property maps, identifying the original boundaries of the Woodward estate that had once included the Deadlands. The underground tunnel system might extend beyond my property lines. Are there other access points? Catherine considered this, then opened an antique cabinet containing surveys dating to the 1800s. The tunnel network was expanded during the Civil War, when the Underground Railroad utilized portions of the original revolutionary system. Together, they identified 3 potential access points on adjacent properties, including one on land still owned by Woodward family descendants. Catherine made another call, this time to Earl Cooper, whose property bordered the southern edge of the Deadlands. Earl's great-grandfather was a conductor on the Underground Railroad, she explained after hanging up. His family has maintained certain traditions of community protection. Within 30 minutes, vehicles began arriving quietly. At the Historical Society, pickup trucks and SUVs belonging to local farmers and business owners. Jacob recognized several faces from the Farmers' Co-op, including Howard Daniels, whose earlier antagonism was noticeably absent. The Preservation Network isn't just historians and academics, Catherine explained as the group gathered in the basement meeting room. It's local families with generational connections to these sites. When the protocol activates, everyone responds. Earl Cooper spread a detailed property map across the table. Mason's team is focused on the main entrance. They don't know about the secondary access points or the extended tunnel network. We can outflank them using the Civil War extensions. Howard Daniels, examining the documents Jacob had retrieved, looked up with newfound respect. My family's been in this county since 1795. Never thought we'd be part of something dating back to Washington himself. The impromptu coalition developed a two-part strategy. Earl would lead a team to secure the perimeter of the Deadlands, documenting Mason's illegal activities and preventing vehicle departure, while Catherine coordinated with approaching state authorities. Meanwhile, Jacob would guide a second team through the Civil War tunnel extensions to secure the main chamber of Liberty's Keep from below. We're not confronting them directly, Catherine emphasized. We're securing historical evidence and establishing legitimate presence until authorities arrive. As the group prepared to depart, Howard approached Jacob. "The Deadlands," he said, shaking his head. "Should have known there was more to that property than rocks and poor soil. You saw what everyone else missed for generations." "Sometimes," Jacob replied. "Worthless land is purposely made to appear that way to protect what's valuable beneath the surface." 6 months after the events at Liberty's Keep, the Deadlands had transformed in ways Jacob could never have imagined. White canopies covered portions of the property, sheltering ongoing archaeological excavations conducted by teams from the Smithsonian, the Virginia Historical Society, and 3 major universities. Students and professors worked methodically across the site, documenting not just Liberty's Keep itself, but an extensive network of Revolutionary-era infrastructure that had remained hidden for nearly 2.5 centuries. Jacob stood on the porch of the now-renovated farmhouse, watching the coordinated activity with quiet satisfaction. The National Historical Preservation Trust's emergency grant had not only funded proper excavation and preservation efforts, but had also restored the historic farmhouse to its original 18th-century appearance, the home Thomas Woodward had built. To monitor and protect Liberty's Keep, the Washington Post interview went well, Catherine Woodward remarked, joining him on the porch with 2 cups of coffee. "You've become quite the media spokesman for historical preservation." Jacob accepted the coffee with a grateful nod. "Still feels surreal. 3 federal agencies, congressional recognition, and apparently the president wants to visit next month. Discovering the most extensive collection of intact Revolutionary War intelligence documents tends to attract attention," Catherine replied with characteristic understatement. The confrontation with Mason Development Group had concluded without violence, but with significant legal repercussions. Their fraudulent government credentials had triggered federal investigations, resulting in charges against key executives and the company's eventual dissolution. More importantly, their attempted raid had exposed a broader network of private collectors and organizations systematically acquiring historical artifacts that should have entered the public domain. The historical significance of Liberty's Keep had exceeded even Jacob's initial assessment. Beyond the intelligence documents, The facility had contained complete records of foreign assistance to the revolutionary cause, including previously unknown support from several European nations beyond France. Historians were still processing the implications for America's founding narrative. Professor Winters called this morning, Jacob mentioned. The University of Virginia has officially approved the Liberty's Keep Research Center with full funding. They're offering me the directorship. Will you accept? Catherine asked, though her knowing smile suggested she already anticipated his answer. A chance to personally oversee the research while remaining here to manage the site? How could I refuse? Howard Daniels's truck pulled up the driveway, now a familiar and welcome sight. The local community's relationship with Jacob had undergone its own revolution. After participating in the preservation efforts on that crucial night, many of Oak Ridge County's longtime residents had embraced their role as protectors of a national historical treasure. Got those heirloom seed varieties you wanted to try? Howard called as he approached the porch, carrying several paper packets. Figured if you're determined to actually farm some portion of this place, you might as well use authentic 18th century crop strains. Jacob had indeed maintained his agricultural ambitions, though they had evolved to incorporate historical farming techniques appropriate for the property's new designation as a living historical site. The eastern acreage he'd originally cleared now demonstrated revolutionary-era agricultural methods, creating an additional educational dimension to the property. The school buses are arriving, Catherine noted, checking her watch. 30 students from Richmond for the educational program. Jacob nodded, finishing his coffee. The Deadlands now hosted regular educational tours, allowing students and visitors to experience both the underground historical treasure and the agricultural practices of revolutionary Virginia. The property, that had once been ridiculed as worthless, now attracted thousands of visitors monthly. As Jacob prepared to greet the arriving students, he reflected on Washington's letter to Thomas Woodward. When the proper guardian discovers this repository, they will recognize the appropriate moment for history's complete telling. After nearly 250 years, that moment had finally arrived, not through the efforts of wealthy collectors or private interests, but through the persistent curiosity of a historian who had seen value where others saw only worthless land. The worthless land had yielded a priceless legacy, not just in historical artifacts, but in the revitalization of a community that had rediscovered its connection to America's founding principles. Jacob's first plowstroke had indeed revealed an underground complex from the Revolutionary era, but it had ultimately uncovered something even more significant, a living connection between past and present, preserved against all odds by generations of quiet guardians for the moment when America most needed to remember its origins. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.